Hi, it's Jan Beta, and today I am going to finish the series about the museum Amiga 500, which is a very early revision 3. And I'm going to take a look at some of the peripherals that came with it in the box. And I'm also going to take another look at the disk drive, and then let's try and restore everything that this came with. So at this point the Amiga itself is fully fixed. It seems to work very reliably. I've had this running for hours. The only thing that doesn't quite work is the disk drive, which kind of became misaligned again after putting it in the case. I aligned this to read most disks I threw at it, but now it's basically back to where we started, and it kind of probably mislocated when I turned this around while putting the screws into the case or something like that. We're going to take another look at that. And then I've been using this power supply, which is a newer model from sometime in the 90s that I recapped. It's one of the lighter Amiga 500 power supplies. This is basically the most reliable power supply I own at the current point in time for Amigas. The original power supply that came with this, which I don't think is the original power supply this machine shipped with, because it has a date code of November 1987, whereas the Amiga itself is from sometime in March 87. I think this obviously needs some TLC, so we're going to take a look at that. And then this also came with a mouse, or actually two mice, one of which might be the original one, a tank mouse and a third-party replacement mouse, probably because the tank mouse was broken at some point. I don't know, we're going to find out. And there's also a SCART monitor cable that came with it, and we're going to take a look at that too. And yeah, that's the plan for today. First up, the power supply. This is one of the heavier models, which are the earlier Amiga 500 power supplies. This is kind of a hybrid between a switching and a linear power supply, so it has a huge transformer in there. Whereas the newer models like this are very lightweight. They are fully switching power supplies, at least mostly. I think there's still a linear regulator for one of the 12-volt rails in there or something. These are mostly linear, so they weigh much more and have a slightly lower amperage output. It says 0.3 amps at 220 volts, which is the European, or the old European mains voltage. We have 5 volts at 2.5 amps. We have 12 volts at 1 amp. We have minus 12 at 0.1 amp. And as you can see, this is super yellowed, and it also has these cable burns, which results from the softening chemicals in the cables seeping out and softening the plastic, the hard plastic of this case here. So this happens when you wrap cables around something. This was probably stored like this for ages. And yeah, you always want to keep your cables separate if you're storing something like this for a longer period of time. One peculiar thing about these is that they are actually serviceable, but Commodore decided to plug the screw holes with these plastic plugs. These are just plugs that hide the screws, basically, these 4 circular things. So the only way to remove these, I think, is brute force. So we're going to have to probably drill a hole. And yeah, this is not a very beautiful power supply, but supposedly, as Stefan, the owner of this Amiga, told me, this still works actually. He measured the voltages. He didn't use it to power the Amiga, but basically this seems to work. So we're going to have to do some maintenance and not a repair on this, probably. First question is, how am I going to get these out? And some regular viewers may remember that I basically destroyed one of these because I didn't realize it had the screws under there until it was too late. I cracked it open. That was my original Amiga 500 power supply that I basically destroyed because I didn't pay attention. So yeah, don't have very high hopes for this, but I'm still going to give this a shot. Just trying to poke something in there. I think it's slightly moving. Yeah, okay, that works. We're only going to destroy these, I guess. So, Pokebit to the rescue. That isn't too bad, actually. These are pretty soft. So, yeah, these are... There's probably no way to get these out in a less destructive way. And people in forums usually suggest drilling a hole to have a better grip on them. But yeah, I got away with this, which is pretty cool. And now we can clearly see the 4 screws that hold this whole malarkey together. And they are regular Phillips screws, so no special tools needed, just a regular Phillips screwdriver. These are long screws. Okay. I didn't want you to tinker with these. There we go. Okay. Old power supply. So here we go. Old school hybrid kind of switching linear power supply. This is, I think, a 7812. This probably is the switching transistor for the switching part of this, which is probably used for the 5-volt line, which needs more oomph. Oh, okay, the transformer is screwed through with 2 screws, actually. So this is screwed into the case. Oh, and it's loose already. So it was a good idea to open this up anyway. Oh, there's another screw here. Okay. Now this comes out. Okay. And the back side of the board looks like this. There's quite a huge scorch mark here from these resistors that are, I think, current limiting resistors. And yeah, they run pretty hot, as is obvious. This is basically how these look after that long time period. Yeah, I think what I want to do is to clean this up, the whole board from both sides, and replace the electrolytic capacitors, because those age, and all of these are 85 degrees Celsius rated ones as far as I can see. So it's a good idea to replace them with higher temperature ratings in a power supply like this, which gets warm. And I found with these older switching power supplies, you don't want to use modern capacitors that are very low ESR, because the older capacitors weren't quite as low ESR, and you can mess things up considerably if you use modern switching power supply capacitors in one of these. So I'm going to go with my regular Panasonic FC series and FR series caps that I have in stock anyway, which should be closer to the original ESR values than modern switching power supply capacitors, which are usually ultra low ESR, things like that. I basically didn't run into any issues just using standard general purpose caps basically on these. And the FC series is low impedance anyway, so that should be more than suitable for the purpose. I'm going to measure these capacitors, which are a common point of failure because they run so warm. But I think in this case, this allegedly works, so they are going to be fine probably. I'm just measuring these in circuit, obviously. And they are in parallel, I think. This is 90 ohms. This is 90 ohms. Yeah, they should be good. I think these are relatively low resistance. That's all as expected. Let me take a couple of seconds to thank the sponsor for this video, PCBWay, my favorite manufacturer of prototype PCBs, who recently turned into kind of a one-stop solution for all the tinkerers' needs. They also do 3D printing, CNC machining, you name it. I highly recommend checking out their website. The link is in the video description. In case you have something you want produced, they can do almost everything back to the Amiga. I'm going to replace the capacitors, I think, and clean it up in the process. And I'm also going to give this a bath in some soapy water and scrub it. And then possibly try some retrobrighting, because, yeah, the difference between the original color, which should pretty much be the inside, and the outside is quite significant. And that's all our capacitors replaced, which are all in this small area here. As I said, I used Panasonic FC mostly and one Panasonic FR series cap here. I'm going to put a list of the original capacitors in the video description, just in case you have the same power supply and are wondering what capacitors go in there. Yeah, I'm going to clean this up and add a dab of hot glue to both of these larger capacitors to prevent them from wiggling too much. The solder joints all look reasonable, the original ones, so I'm not going to do any reflowing of those. I don't think that's necessary. I'm going to give this a good wipe with some isopropyl alcohol though. And these boards are single-sided boards. It's pretty thin, the PCB is super thin. So you want to be very careful to not break it. And also, one thing I noticed is that the PCB doesn't have any polarity markings, so you want to make sure you get your capacitors in the correct polarity. I took pictures of the board before I started the recapping. That's always a good idea with anything you work on, really. And unfortunately, the heat sinks on these are bolted on these transistors and voltage regulators. So yeah, I would have to drill these out, which I'm not going to do. Otherwise, it probably would be a good idea to replace the thermal compound on these. But yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that, I think, because it still looks reasonably good. So added a bit of hot glue to the larger capacitors and also to this coil here, which was wiggling a bit too much for my taste. So now the electronical side should be good to go. I want to give this a quick test run, I think. So I'm going to plug this in. I have my multimeter set to volts DC and I'm actually measuring on the DIN connector, and one way to do this safely is to use a bit of heat shrink tubing. I just use this cutout heat shrink tubing so I don't risk shorting the pins out against each other. That's a method that I use all the time ever since I found that to work. So this should be ground and we should have plus 12 here. Just turn this on. Didn't explode, that's good. That's plus 12. We should have plus 5 on this pin here. That's our plus 5. We should have minus 12 on the center pin. That's a bit high, but that's reasonable. Plus the minus 12 is the least important one of all of those. That's minus 16. It's going to change a bit under load. But yeah, I think that's reasonable. None of the capacitors is bulging, which they would do if they were in the wrong polarity pretty much instantly. They get really hot and bulge and explode if you get them in the wrong polarity, in a power supply like this at least. Let's take a look at the mouse this came with. Apart from this being very filthy and yellow, it says Amiga made in Hong Kong. So yeah, not much information. Guess we're going to have to take this apart and clean it thoroughly. Okay, this is crusty. So there's only 2 screws on these and the rest of it is clipped together. Yeah, this needs a good makeover and the cable is also filthy. So we're going to clean this and give it a good retrobrighting, I think, because yeah, it is super yellow. Unlike the case of the actual Amiga, which is kind of fortunate. I wouldn't want to risk damaging that with retrobrighting, but the mouse and the power supply probably we can try to bring them back. There is kind of a connection between the cheese and mouse, but we don't want this to look like this. So this should just come apart now. And these are actually welded. The other plastic for the buttons is welded to the brighter shade plastic. Yeah, this is an early one, I think. Yeah, I don't know if we can find a date code somewhere in here. Yeah, this is just how these look. They have these membrane switches here, metal switches. So let's see if we can find a date code in here. Yeah, no, not really. This is our LM339 and it says 71.9. It's definitely not made in 1971, I believe. So that's not much of a date code. But we have another screw here and then we can lift this whole thing out. Because this is hilariously filthy. Yeah, as you can see. And we also need to clean the wheels in here that are actually supposed to be moved by the ball. So I'm just going to put all the plastic parts into the sink. And I'm also including the ball from the mouse because this is so filthy. These are going to get some warm water and some window cleaner and some dish soap. And I'm going to let them soak for a good while and then scrub them. Now let's try and clean these wheels here a bit as the first step. I'm using Q-tips and isopropyl. You might want to use some sputter tools to scrape off some of the infestation there, which is what I'm doing now. This is hilariously filthy. Yeah, some of these wheels are really corroded. That's unfortunately not uncommon with these because yeah, the dirt gets stuck on there and then probably moisture is held on there with the dirt and then you get corrosion. With these metal wheels that is a problem, unfortunately. Otherwise they are more sturdy. But unfortunately, that comes at a price, which is corrosion. And then they kind of deform a bit. And the movement of the mouse is not going to be as smooth as it could be. Yeah, after a whole lot of scraping and cleaning with Q-tips, this is pretty much the best I can do. You can see this wheel here. Still, yeah, you can probably see it better like that. This is still, it looks dirty, but it's all corroded. There's not much dirt left on there, I think. The Amiga also came with this QuickShot mouse, which is in a way better state. Interestingly, QuickShot, known for joysticks, actually made mice too back in the day. So we have a switchable Amiga and Atari mouse here. This works on the Amiga and the Atari ST, which basically use the same mouse, just with some different pinout, slightly different. And this one is actually pretty clean. And it also feels like this has micro switches. So this is a better mouse anyway. Ah, yeah, this feels smooth. This was in there for a reason, because somebody replaced the original tank mouse, which are not the best mice in the world anyway, with this that they probably used during most of the life of the machine. So yeah, not much we need to do on this one because it's pretty much intact. I'm going to give this a quick wipe and then I think this is good to go. Has some dirt on here, but it feels absolutely smooth, so no need to take this apart. And it's not part of the original Amiga heritage, so this I'm just going to leave this untouched. Another item that came in the Amiga box is this SCART cable, which has a metal 23-pin sub-D connector, which is an old connector, obviously. I don't think this is an original Commodore one, because the Commodore cables I've seen usually have a Commodore logo on this connector. Yeah, this looks pretty aftermarket to me. It's a thick cable, so it's not a bad cable at all, probably well shielded. I'm going to try to see if this works. If it doesn't work, it's probably not much of a loss. You can still buy Amiga SCART cables these days. So in order to test both the mouse and the monitor cable, I have hooked up my crystal clear Amiga 500. I'm using the modern power supply, or the known working one. And I put another ball into the mouse temporarily. And as you can see, it somewhat works. We get up and down movement working pretty well. Fire buttons. The left mouse button is also not very good. The right mouse button works better, not perfect. So maybe we have a broken tank mouse here. Up and down works, kind of, but we don't get left or right movement reliably, I think. As you can see, the X position of the mouse is basically stuck on 0. Yeah, I guess we have to figure that out. And the monitor cable just gives me the white screen and then it fades out. That's probably not a good sign, especially since the resistor on the Denise chip in the museum Amiga was broken. So I'm not going to try to use this anymore. I'm going to have a look at this, but I don't think it's worth fixing because, as I said, it's very likely not an original cable. And I also really want to finish the restoration on that old Amiga, and the cable is definitely not part of that restoration. There's probably a short somewhere in the cable, I would guess, or something like that. Unfortunately, with my known good monitor cable, it still works. The crystal clear Amiga still works, so we didn't break this one. Yeah, so I was looking at the mouse some more, and I did a whole video about fixing a 1351 Commodore 64 mouse. You can actually often fix these by looking at these resistors here. That's a very tedious process because we have to figure out new resistor values for these 4 resistors. There are 2 for each direction pair. Basically, there are infrared diodes and phototransistors in here that register the light shining through these discs that spin when you move the mouse. And there's little cutouts in these discs that allow the light to shine through to the resistor from the LEDs. And these values should reach logic levels that are interpreted by the little chip on here. Yeah, and basically these resistors are completely out of whack because the plastic slightly deforms and the light is not as bright. Sometimes the LEDs wear out, and that's something that also happens. And then some of the directions do no longer work, as in this case. I am probably going to make this a separate video and try to figure that out, because this is, as you can see in my 1351 repair video, this is a very involved process that's probably not going to fit into one single video like this. I am going to take a look at this, definitely, but probably outsource it into another video. So there's going to be another video, yay! I am going to clean the cable though. So that's something that we can do in this video, with a microfiber cloth and some window cleaner, which usually helps a fair bit. These cables are super filthy. Probably also going to double this up with some alcohol. But eventually the cables are going to be a bit cleaner. Yeah, this is going to take some patience. Yeah, it's way better than before. Yeah, there was quite some dirt on there. I'm going to do the same with the power supply cables, I think. But I'm not going to show you the whole process, because it's boring. Okay, after a lot of scrubbing, kind of getting there. These are so filthy, kind of unbelievable. But yeah, that's how these look after years of use and abuse and like spilling drinks on them and things like that. But they are starting to look reasonable. Wow, okay, way better than before. And a lot of dirt on my microfiber cloth here, as you can see. Let's take a look at the case parts. They are significantly cleaner than before, but still super yellow. And I'm going to go into retrobrighting right away. So let's get retrobrighting. I didn't even dry these off completely. I'm going to wipe these again with alcohol because you want stuff absolutely clean before retrobrighting. And I guess we don't have much to lose, especially on this one, which has these scorch marks from the cables. I'm going to use 12% peroxide cream, spread it around with a paintbrush, wrap it up in cling wrap, and then shine a light on that, a full spectrum light that is a full spectrum LED plant growth light, grow light. And my hope is that we can get this brownish yellow a bit to look more like this again, like the original color that this had. Yeah, let's do that. Let's clean this up and put some peroxide cream on it and wrap it up. This must be the most yellowed plastic I've ever worked with, so we're going to see if this gets us anywhere. It might. I'm just going to wrap it up nicely. And the insides are not important. So we just want an even coat of this stuff on the outside. So next up, I'm going to do this with all the parts and try to spread the cream evenly. And then this stuff goes into my retrobrighting box for some hours. It usually takes like, I don't know, 4 hours, 6 hours. It depends on how the stuff reacts. It's pretty much a waiting game. And into the retrobrighting box it goes. So this is very much just a cardboard box that I have to fix at some point, that I put some aluminum foil into. I glued that in to reflect the light. I'm just going to stand this up slightly. And then close it up and put my grow light thingy on here. And then I'm going to turn this on and come in every half hour or so and massage the cream around so we don't get any streaking. This is a super boring process, so I'm not going to bore you with the details. Let's see where this goes. Now for the remaining issue with the Amiga 500 itself, which is the floppy disk drive. I spent several hours trying to align it properly, and it did work in the last video briefly, and when I put it back together it basically stopped working again and got misaligned slightly. So I went in and tried aligning it again for several hours. I basically spent a whole working day on it and I couldn't make it work reliably. I managed to make it read quite a few disks, and then after a while it started to not read basically any disks again. I still suspect there's something wrong with the spring tension that I mentioned in the previous video that holds the head down on the disk or close enough to the disk so that the magnetical data can actually be read. But yeah, it's pretty much a lost cause. At least with my skill set, I'm not going to be able to get this to work in any reliable way. And I'm not ready to spend like a week on this drive, because basically it's going to end up not being super reliable anyway. So I have another solution, which is kind of a workaround. I'm not going to put a GoTech in this. I have something slightly better, which is still going to be slightly more modern than what would usually be in an Amiga, and hopefully a bit more reliable. So I found a seller on eBay who actually sells these PC drives that he mods to be compatible with the Amiga. Usually you can mod certain PC drives to work in Amigas. PC drives and Amiga drives basically are the same disk drives, but they use kind of different signals on this connector. The eBay seller I found mods these in a way so that they fit into an Amiga 500, and he even put an eject button here that very closely resembles the color. So this is a more recent drive than all the Amiga drives that I have. It's a PC drive, so probably it would work better with HD disks that are formatted for double density. The Amiga is not going to be able to read HD formatted disks with this, obviously, but chances are that this is going to be quite a reliable drive. The case is a bit modded to fit the Amiga, and the standoffs are probably a slightly different height than the original Amiga disk drive. I'm going to put this in here and see if this works. It should probably, hopefully work. I haven't tested this in anything yet, so I hope that the seller wasn't fooling me. This is a Samsung SFD321, and I'm very aware of the fact that this is not something that has any museum value or anything like that. This is just a bog standard PC disk drive. I think this is a good way to finish this restoration, because this is going to be more reliable than the original drive by a lot. And I suppose this machine should be used in the future, or if it is in a museum, it should be in a museum where it can be used by people to actually enjoy the machine. And I think that's a good workaround. And it's not going to be visible from the outside, because this looks just like an Amiga eject button, which maybe it even is. It's just glued on here. Long story short, I'm going to put this in there and try if it actually works better than the drive that is currently in there, which doesn't really work at all. And I also hope that it physically fits and looks the part. That's very important. And I'm obviously going to hold on to this drive. I'm going to keep it with the Amiga, basically. So if anybody manages to fix that, it can be reattached to this Amiga, but I'm not that person. Yeah, let's remove the screws. That's actually screwed in from the bottom here. So yeah, that drive really gave me headaches. Basically, every time I put it back in the Amiga, it stopped working. There we go. Yeah, these are in the correct spots, at least. And then this one is for this here. So let's see if we can fit this in there. Yeah, the position of the screws looks reasonable. Oh, and it also has the power connector on the other side. Yeah, this actually looks halfway decent. Let's see if we can screw this down. Okay, that looks promising. It appears our eject button is in the right spot as well. Okay, moment of truth. And the disk drive is not ticking. So possibly we have to connect the cable the other way around. Yes, we have. There's a 1 on the other end. That's the thing, the differences between PC drives and Amiga drives. One of them is that the connector is the other way around. So whereas we have the 1 on this side, on the Amiga drive, we have the 1 on the other side, on this one. Yeah, we're going to have to remove the shielding again to do this properly, I guess. Okay, let's see if that helped. Yep, drive is ticking. Let's start something up that didn't work before. Magnificent! Okay, this disk drive seems to work. I'm going to do some more tests and see if it really fully works, and then put the shielding back in. and actually close the Amiga up. Yeah, it appears to be working. I don't have the sound hooked up, so we're not hearing the incredibly great title track from Turrican. Yeah, the drive appears to work very well, and the seller also advertised it as being cleaned and lubricated, so we don't have any more work to do on that. And it also booted, I don't know if I've shown this in the last video, my Workbench copy from back in the day. This is basically just a copy of my original 1.3 Workbench that was really marginal, and it doesn't work on a lot of my drives, but on this one it boots fine. It doesn't give me a read error like on all the other drives. So I suppose this drive is probably the best drive of all the Amiga drives I own at this point, but I'm not going to be the owner for very long because this is obviously going to be sent back to Stefan soon. Once I truly and utterly finish this, shouldn't put this on the ventilation slots. Shouldn't put discs on the ventilation slots on the power supply. I've gotten a bit carried away. So let's put the shielding back in. Yeah, the routing of the cable is not ideal because it was bent in the other direction for such a long time. But I suppose we're going to have to live with that. And as long as it works, I'm fine. It's just a disk drive cable. It's not going to break or anything like that. Yep. It does appear to work fine. Okay, huge moment for me and for you, putting the screws back in. So this restoration must be the one I put the most effort in ever, basically. Already, I'm still working on it. Pretty glad with how this turned out, and I'm finally putting the case screws back in. Hope I don't have to open this again, but I think everything should be all right. I think one thing that is left to do, now looking at the back side of this, is to put some new rubber feet on here. These are just 3M bump-on, and I think they used beige ones originally, or white ones. I only have black ones. These are going to have to do. This is going to complete the Amiga restoration. And these fit very well. They fit on a lot of different devices actually. Lots of retro computers used these, including the Commodore 64 and the Atari, I believe. Atari STs also have these. They should be available in white somewhere, but I didn't find any. This is what the disk drive now looks like. I think I can totally live with that. Yeah, that does work very well. This part is finally done, I think. And it works, which is the most important part. And it's still pretty true to its original specs. Except it has a replacement disk drive in there. Other than that, the memory expansion that's in here is not an original one. That's the original one this came with actually, but it's a newer one than the actual Amiga. So not quite period correct, but it should work absolutely the same as the period correct Amiga memory expansion. Pretty satisfied with the result. And as I said, it's slightly yellowed, but it is more obvious. The yellowing is not that bad because these keyboards are a lighter shade of this beigeish, grayish kind of color than the original Amiga cases were. So the keyboard was always a tiny bit brighter than the case. And as you can see, the difference is not that significant. I think this is pretty much how these looked when these were new. And drum roll, here's the results from around 8 hours of retrobrighting in my little retrobrighting box. You can still see hints of yellow, obviously, but the parts turned out a lot better than they were. Especially the mouse looks pretty much as good as new, except for some of these glide pads being slightly dislocated. But we're going to take care of that in a separate video, as I said. The power supply, yeah, there's nothing much to save on these cable marks, I think. But the color is a lot better, even though it's not perfect. But given the state it was in, I think this is a respectable result. So let's put the power supply back together and then try everything in conjunction. It's not too bad. I'm also going to put the mouse back together temporarily, just to have a look at it. And you can see the color difference between this piece and the rest of the mouse. This is even a bit yellow compared to the rest, the little flap. Otherwise it looks pretty much as good as new. That's nice. So now here's the moment we've all been waiting for, or at least I have been looking forward to. Let's see if our refurbished power supply actually powers our Amiga. Should be pretty safe, because usually if these fail, they don't fail in catastrophic ways that could damage the Amigas. So we should be safe if this works at all. Let's see. And it doesn't do anything. Why? We measured this. It's not powering on at all. Does the Amiga still work? Yep. And the Amiga starts up fine with the known good power supply. So we have to take another look at the power supply. Is this ever going to end? At least the Amiga is not damaged. But I'm going to have another look at our power supply. Whatever happened to that? I think we had all the voltages on there. You are my witnesses. But even if the power supply doesn't work, I still call this kind of a win, at least partially. Because the mouse looks good, even if it doesn't work. The Amiga itself seems to still work. I am going to call it a day for this episode, and we're going to have another episode about this museum Amiga 500 sometime. So we're going to have to do some more work on this, or I am going to have to do some more work on this. We're going to take a look at the mouse and see if that is recoverable. We are going to take a look at the power supply, which for some reason stopped working after it was working. Otherwise the Amiga seems to be in pretty good shape, and the new disk drive seems to work very well. I'm going to call it a day. Thank you very much for your support on Patreon and on Ko-fi and on the channel memberships page here on YouTube. I hope to see you again on this channel sometime, maybe for the hopefully final episode of this Amiga 500 restoration. Thanks for watching. I'm Jan Beta. See you next time. Bye!